This is Ryan Perry with The Helpful Bit. Today we are going to be talking about source control and release management for the Power Platform. If you have worked with the platform for very long, you've probably heard these terms. This presentation is specifically geared towards how to get your team up and running with it. There is a lot of content out there about setting up the Azure DevOps pipelines, and we aren't going to be going into setting up the actual pipelines, but instead we're going to be providing a high-level overview of the process. From there, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty Git commands that the pipelines use, so Git and the CLI, and we'll be demonstrating with live demos how to run everything the pipeline does from a fundamental level, as well as via the automated pipelines themselves. So for the citizen developers that maybe aren't really keen or ready to dive into running a command line, running Git commands, we're going to show how all of this can be automated so that they can just make things, get it deployed, and be up and running. So that said, let's go ahead and dive in. This is source control and release management for the Power Platform. On today's agenda, we're not actually going to talk about setting up the pipelines. Plenty of content for that, and I can provide links to it if you'd like. Instead, this is going to be geared towards getting your team up and running. So we're going to talk about why source control briefly, step through the big picture, how it all works. From there, we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty fundamentals, the actual Git commands that are used by the pipelines, and do a demo stepping through the process that is occurring behind the scenes so that you have a really high-level overview of everything going on. But more importantly, we're going to step back from there and then do an additional demo of all of this in an automated fashion so that your individual citizen developers who maybe aren't comfortable running on the command line can feel comfortable adopting source control and getting on board with it. So right off the top, let's dive into it. Why source control? If you've been working on the Power Platform for any length of time, you've probably heard the term application lifecycle management. I'm sure you've probably heard of Git as well. And if you're a pro developer, you might have been screaming, why aren't we using this? If you're a citizen developer, you might not really know what the big deal is. If you're a sole developer, let's just be clear, source control may be overkill for you. There are definitely some benefits, but we're going to talk about this in the context of a team and just make note of the things that you'll get as a sole developer that would apply to you if you are one individual in a company. The big problem, or the benefit that you get from source control, is release management, the ability to isolate features that are being worked on. If you have multiple developers in a company, say developer A starts working on a form and developer B touches that same form, developer A can no longer deploy his solution without leaking those features. Okay? Of course, you can undo those and then export and redo them, but that's a big hassle. So this is the problem we're trying to solve. Along with that, I have seen companies that will put developers in separate development environments, but then they don't have a way to merge their work. They'll deploy from one, deploy from the other, deploy from the other, and they just revert things back and forth. So deployment gridlock can be another one with dependencies. Say, for example, you have a view, you add a field to your view, and then someone else goes to deploy a solution that also contains that view, and because they don't have that field in their solution, they get a dependency issue and they're not able to deploy. So you have a little bit of gridlock that you then have to decide either to include that field in their solution or revert your changes so that they can deploy, etc. So it rapidly becomes, once you get beyond 2 or 3 developers, the ability to communicate all those changes and coordinate it just becomes very challenging. So a few other things. I mentioned some companies will deploy from separate dev environments with reversions. Even if you don't do that, I have seen solutions that are treated like they are releases, which that paradigm shift needs to occur. They'll deploy one layer on top of another, and before you know it, they've deployed the same component in 10 different solutions with each incremental change. And if they decide they want to remove that, it becomes nearly impossible because they've got it in a solution stack that's 10 plus layers deep. So with source control, instead, what you do is you deploy a new version of the same solution It's only in one, maybe two layers if you have a base solution, and then individual app solutions per se, and you're able to remove things a lot more easily. Being able to look at the solution history is another huge thing. If you are working inside of a CDS environment as a user, you can always look at the audit history and you can see when things have changed and by whom. If you are a developer without source control, however, there isn't really a mechanism in place to be able to see who made the change or why they did it if you want to go talk to them and understand the logic behind it. When you switch over to using source control, you are going to have a Git repository, and you will be able to see the timeline of when things changed. You can put developers in separate dev environments, and with each one of their commits, they can make a note about what the changes are. If there's, say, you're not in code where they can just comment it right in the code, there's the Git commit note, and you're able to get a much clearer picture of what's going on. With that, you have the ability to revert or back up different changes in your history. Now, I will note that if you are working without source control, you do have the option to spin up another environment and restore your solution from backup and then pull out, say, that one JavaScript file that you blew away. And that is an option, but it's not nearly as smooth of an experience. You don't have the ability to pull individual lines out. You can only go back so far. I don't recall exactly, but I think it's only a matter of a few weeks that your backups are good for. Whereas your source control, you could go back from 6 months ago when this other developer that has since left the company, and you can see exactly when changes were made. So really, it is very empowering. You'll get a lot out of it as a team. Of course, that solution history can be very helpful as an individual, and you'll want to get going up with it even for that reason alone. Say you don't want to tackle this yet, there are a few alternatives. And I put those in quotes because really these aren't truly alternatives. First of all, solution segmentation as a best practice should be implemented in your organization. That's basically just saying, you know what, this app belongs in this solution, this one belongs in this, and as much as possible keeping the work isolated based on functional segmentation is the way I like to do it. Eventually you'll get to the point, however, where you'll find that there are interdependencies, and so it's not a cure-all. Same thing with feature flags, with the potential for leaks if something is inadvertently released into production. If you have implemented a feature flag, basically a variable that allows you to turn a feature on or off, you can turn that off. So in your development, you'll want to be using feature flags and following a strict release cadence. As I mentioned, separate dev environments. I would not actually consider this to be a real alternative in any way. Really, it's more of an anti-pattern because, again, if you're deploying from separate environments but you don't have a way to sync things back and forth without overriding changes in the other dev environment, then you really don't gain much benefit from being in separate dev environments. So just make a mental note of that. If you're not using source control, it's questionable how much benefit you'll get from having separate environments if you don't have a way to merge them. Again, if you do follow solution segmentation, you may have some. That's just my personal opinion on that. So if you've decided, yes, as a team, we are wanting to use source control, we've heard great things about what you can do with it, a couple prerequisites. You are going to need someone on your team that is a little more geared towards the pro dev, okay? Most of your team can just be the citizen developers. They don't have to work with the command line, but particularly when it comes to addressing merge conflicts when they do occur, you're going to need someone that understands the basics of Git. They don't have to be a Git god, but they need to know how to push, pull, and do a basic merge. So not to be intimidated about, you can Google that online, you can learn it fairly quickly, a couple days or weeks, and you'll know everything you need to know as far as being able to work through a basic merge commit. So don't let that scare you. That said, we are going to dive in the nitty-gritty so you have an understanding of what's going on under the hood with this presentation before we show the easy way of doing it with automation. A couple shifts in paradigm. Your environment is not source control. As we covered, you can back things up from source control, but with source control you get so much more with the revision history, the ability to pull individual commits and changes, to merge things, and an environment is really just a place to work. So your CDS environment, the Maker portal, is a development WYSIWYG editor, but you can also do these same changes in Visual Studio if they're basic. Another paradigm shift is that a solution is not a feature release. I have seen companies that will basically for every feature create a new solution and again create just this pile of solutions, which if you're working in a managed target environment, again best practice managed solutions, it can become a nightmare. In fact, that's a big reason why a lot of companies are very reluctant to embrace managed solutions, is because of that improper deployment of solutions, which should have just been a solution with a new version. So as you're diving into this, you want to have a shift in paradigm that you don't release new solutions. That's just a mechanism to transport the solution. What you should be doing is creating a feature and updating the solution as a new solution that you then deploy to the newest version of that solution. So how does this work? Shifts in paradigm. As a single developer, or if you haven't yet embraced source control, you're probably used to exporting a solution and then going to your other environment and importing it. That's not how it works with source control. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to have all of your code stored in a source control branch, which we typically call main. Again, we're taking this from a very beginner level for your citizen developers. From that main branch, you're going to create a copy of that branch. You're going to branch that so you have your own working version, and then you can go to work on it in your own environment. Now, asterisk on there, your own environment doesn't have to be a CDS, a Dataverse development environment, the Maker portal. You can literally make the changes right in Visual Studio Code if you're a pro dev and you know what you're doing, you just want to change some field names. We'll even demo that for you here. You're going to make your changes though, whether it's in your Visual Studio or if it's in the Maker portal. You'll make those changes, you'll test them in your separate isolated environment, and when you're feeling like it's good, you'll go ahead and pull in and merge the latest changes that others have made in the main branch so that you can verify your changes are compatible with it. And if everything looks good, you submit what's called a pull request, which basically just says to your release manager that you have made these changes, you have a feature ready to go. It needs to be reviewed by him, potentially your testers that have been in the environment and checked out everything and said, yeah, this looks great. He's showed us that we like it. And he will then merge that into the main branch. Again, we're just going through this at the high level for the citizen developers. Once that is merged into the main branch, that triggers an automated build, which creates a new version of your solution. Again, it's not a new solution per se, it's a new version of it, which would then be deployed to your other testing environments if you've got multiple, or ultimately to your main environment. So pretty straightforward, but maybe a little hard to visualize without a visual. So let's talk about it a little broader scope, multiple developers on the team and how this is all coordinated. As noted, you've got your main dev branch, which if you're just getting started, probably your developers are all in one single dev branch. But what you're going to do is you're going to put all your stuff in source control. So you will export that, if it's not already there, into a main source control branch, which you can see right here. And if you are a developer asked to work on this feature teal, you are going to create a copy. You're going to branch that main branch and start your work on it, which you can either do again in Visual Studio directly if you're just making small changes, or you can go ahead and push that into another Dataverse environment and use the WYSIWYG Power Apps Maker portal that you know and love. Every so often you're going to go ahead and make a commit and push that back to source control. Again, there's automated pipelines, but we're going to show you under the hood how this all works. And ultimately you'll get to the point where you say, you know what, this is ready to go. You will pull in from the main branch anything that may have changed in the meantime. In this example, there aren't any other changes. Test it, and if everything looks good, you submit that pull request to bring that back into main. Okay. Once it is in main, this triggers an automated process which will then create a managed version of the solution which you then deploy to test and prod. So that's just the same thing we just went through, just with a visual. At the same time, this ability to control versions and releases, another developer may be asked to work on a different feature. So they also are going to create a copy of that main branch. They will start working in a separate dev environment. But the magic here is they're totally isolated. There's no way they're going to leak your work. They will make the same series of commits for whatever they're working on, not the same series, their own series of commits. And when they are ready to go, they will then say, hey, let me merge in everything that you've done, or any other developers that may have been working and committed stuff to main. Once they have those changes, they will go through the testing as well, and they will submit their own pull request to bring that into main, which then again triggers a new version, version 1.1 here, which is then deployed to your production environment. Okay, so that is the high-level overview of source control. If you are a citizen developer, you've never done it, in a nutshell, it basically is giving us the ability to take changes from two different developers, keep them isolated while they're being worked on, and then merge them together. So, next thing, we are going to, at this point, dive into the nitty-gritty fundamentals. So we're going to go pro code now, talk about how this works under the hood. A couple things you'll need. PowerShell, which is on any Windows machine, or you can download it for Mac if you're running on Mac or Linux. And you will need the Power Apps CLI. Eventually, you'll also probably want this configuration migration utility. If you've been working on the Power Platform, you probably, if you moved any data, used this using the user interface, but it also has a command line component. You can interact with it just from the command line. So fundamentals, the blocking and tackling, what you're going to be doing, and again, we'll go through this pretty quickly because we're going to do a demo of it here in just a second. First thing first, you're going to go ahead and install the latest. Here I've got the environment variables set up that we're using. Authenticating is just this pack auth create command, connect to the environment. From there, you need to get your stuff in source control. So either you clone a repo that already exists, or you're going to do the third step on here. You're going to export from an environment that has your solution and unpack it. So when you export it, you're going to get a zip file. In fact, the same zip file that you would get if you went into the user interface and said export it. It's the exact same thing. Unpack that, commit it to your source control branch, and then you can push it up to your main. On the flip side, you will also, of course, need to occasionally take those components from source control, pack them into a solution, and import them. So those commands are right here. And then, of course, the other skill that you will need to have on your team is knowing how to merge things, particularly if you have a merge conflict, which, again, in our presentation, we are going to be demoing that specifically. Once everything's good to go, of course, the last thing is just submitting a pull request, so you push it up to main and then complete the pull request, which we'll be using Azure DevOps, but you could just as easily have your stuff stored in, say, GitHub. It's whatever tool is your preference. So that said, let's go ahead and do a demo. We're going to just dive right into the nitty-gritty. First, after the nitty-gritty, we're going to shift gears and show you how this all works using the Azure DevOps pipelines instead, so that for the citizen developer, it's just click a button and go. Okay. All right, for the demo, what we have here is in my environment, you can see I have a single solution right here just called demos. And in that, we have a table that has this form. On the form, we're going to have some changes we want to make to it. Let's say we're going to have a British version of the form that uses surname and given name, and then we'll have an American version of the form just to illustrate a merge conflict. So for this first walkthrough, we're going to do everything nitty-gritty using the command line, and then on the second one we're going to come back and show you that you can literally just push this all through the automated pipeline. So we're going to take this form and make some changes to it. Now I already have this in a repo, so if you come back here and look at my repos and the branches, go to our main branch, and we're going to start on a new feature. We'll call this the American form. We're going to go ahead and copy that repo URL, and then if we switch over to our PowerShell window, right on the C prompt, we'll just do it here, git clone, paste in that URL, and we're going to go ahead and pull that down. Now what that did is it just took everything that is in source control from that repo, and it created a folder right there called THB demos, which I had since deleted. So cd THB demos, and then if we open our Visual Studio, we can go ahead and see what all is contained in this solution. So let me go ahead and just pull this over here. And if we look in here, you'll see there is a folder called Solutions. This could contain multiple solutions, but for this demo, we have just the one, Demos. Inside of here, we have a list of the entities. Inside of there, you have that one we were talking about, and then you've got your form XML, your main forms, and this is the actual code for that form in XML form. Now, as noted, we can import everything into the target environment, but we don't necessarily have to. So let's go ahead and just make some changes directly in the code first, just to demonstrate this. So if we're making the American form changes, the first thing we're going to do, we just pulled that down. We actually want to create our own branch. So git checkout -b American form. Okay, so this is our feature. We're going to make this form Americanized. And with that, we're going to go ahead and just make some changes in here. Instead of this being labeled as first name, we're going to capitalize it. First name. And the description right here is called notes. We'll call that description, capitalized. And then last name, same thing here. Last name. Okay, so we can make those couple changes, and then just to be clear, we can git add, git commit, made changes in Visual Studio, American form. Okay, whatever your commit message is. So we've gone ahead and made that commit. We could then go ahead and push it up and merge it. But before we do that, let's say maybe the changes we want to make were more extensive and we weren't comfortable doing all of that directly in code. We want to use the Maker portal. How do we do that? That's where these command lines, command applets come into play. So in this solution, I have the sample scripts right here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and authenticate to the environment. So I've got some variables for this all set up in advance. We're going to just copy and paste that. But then we are going to authenticate to that environment, which is just a simple commandlet, pack auth create. It's going to ask me for my password for the help bit right here. And we are now authenticated. Okay. All of this stuff that we just pulled out of source control is not in a solution. We need to actually pack that into a solution, which is just this command, and then we need to import it. So the packing into a solution, you'll see, goes lightning fast. You just put it there. What that does is it creates a zip file, which is, zips are all listed in my .gitignore, so it won't be added to the source control itself, because it's just, again, the mechanism to get it into the environment. But then once we have that zip file, which is listed right here, this THB solutions demos local pack.zip, we can go ahead and run another command, this pack solution import. Go ahead and run that. What that's going to do is it's going to take that packed solution, and just as if you were a user going to the user interface and hitting the upload button, it's going to push it up into the environment and publish it. Okay, so while that runs, let's just talk a little bit about what's inside of this solution structure. If you open the other folder, you'll see there's a file here called solution.xml that has all of your publisher information here. And then down towards the bottom, there is a tag called root components. So what this is more or less a table of contents for everything, all of the components that are in your solution. Every one of these has a type. If you Google solution component entity reference docs.microsoft.com, you'll be able to pull up a list of what this enumeration means. But basically, a number 1 is an entity, a number 80, or I think the 29 is the form, 80 is the form. I don't know off the top of my head, but you know, you can go look it up. Point here being, this needs to correspond with what you actually have in the folder structure. If you're doing a merge and you find that somehow you end up with one of these listed twice, that's a no-no. Anything that's listed here needs to be contained in the folder structure. Okay, so in this case, we're just making one change to the form. While we were discussing that, you'll see that the publish all has run. Another thing you'll note is that this only ran to 15%. The estimates on the percentage complete, just to be fully transparent, I don't know how they estimate that, but it's never 100%. It's either like 10% or 50%, or on a big solution, sometimes it runs and it gets up to like 100% and then just sits there for a while and then eventually finishes. So just be aware of that if you're doing this from the command line. Again, we are going to be doing this all using pipelines where you won't even see this here in a little bit. So we made those changes here. If we now switch over to the environment in which we are working and refresh this form, we'll probably have to do it twice because of caching. You can see those changes that we just made have been made in there. So we made the changes directly in code. You don't actually need to use the solution editor, the Power Apps Maker WYSIWYG editor to do that. But we didn't get everything, so let's go ahead and say, you know what, maybe there were changes that I wasn't comfortable making in the code. If I just go ahead and refresh the form edit over here, we can just as easily make those same changes using the Power Apps Maker Studio. So in here on the form, it looks like we got the birth date, so let's just say this one should be birth date, okay, and the spouse name, we'll just call that partner because we're being politically correct over here, I guess, and the name, this is the record name, and the description's good to go, record owner as well. So whatever you want to call it. We'll go ahead and save that. Now, we could publish it here, but we really don't need to. Reason being is if we go back to here, to our Visual Studio, and we wanted to pull those changes back into our local branch, if we look at our scripts, we've got the command lines for that just as well. So right here, publish and export, and unpack, I'm going to go ahead and just run both of those together. So we're going to do the opposite, paste that in here. And what this is going to do is it's going to take those changes I just made in the solution editor. It's going to publish all to make sure that everything's published, and it's going to export it back to my local source control branch where I'm currently working. Okay, so we'll go ahead and let that run, and we'll regroup once it's complete. Okay, so as you can see, the solution finished exporting, and then it went through the unpacking steps. And if we look in the solution editor again here, the Visual Studio, and look at those forms, you'll find that the rest of those, the birth date and the partner, have been updated as well. So the changes we made in the environment we've pulled down. Now, the next thing we want to do is we actually need to submit this as a pull request to the deployment manager. Before we do that, what would be best practice, of course, is we want to pull in the latest from main, make sure we don't have any merge conflicts. So again, that's pretty straightforward. We'll go through the steps individually just to be clear. Let's commit what we have here, git commit -m made changes in the maker portal American, right? So, oh, I forgot to add. So, git add, then commit our message so that those are ready to go there. And then let's go ahead and check out main. Pull down the latest from main, which in this example we haven't made any other changes, but there might have been changes. And then we would switch back to the last branch we were on, the American form, and git merge main. Okay. Now in this case, no conflicts. There was really nothing to merge, but you may have a merge conflict, and we will come back to that after doing our other demo because we'll intentionally create one. Once that's good to go, push, and we get an error. Because we did our branch locally, this American form branch doesn't actually exist. Pretty straightforward. Git tells us what to do, so git push set upstream origin American form. And now that is going to push all those changes back up to the repository on the remote server, in this case Azure DevOps. And we can then go ahead and submit our pull request. So, switching back over to DevOps, we cloned that, we made those changes. If we go look in our branches again, we can now see that that branch has been added. It's right here, American form. You can see that those two commits that we've made are ready to go. And DevOps is kindly giving us a little notice. Hey, you've made some changes to American form. Do you want to create a pull request? You might not always do this with multiple things going on, but at any point you can just go into pull requests and create one whenever you need. So we would go ahead and come in here and say, yes, I've tested this, etc. Put in your description. Go ahead and create that pull request. Now, this pull request is not yet complete, but you'll see it's done the check. We already checked it ourselves, but it also verified there aren't any merge conflicts. And your deployment manager would be able to come in here, review your code. You can have a second developer look at it if your policy says that you would require that. And once it's done, they would go ahead and approve it. Now, we're going to hold off on approving this for a second because we want to take a step back and say, all right, well, that was good and well, but I don't know how to run the command line. I'm not a developer. I'm a maker in the portal, a citizen developer. I aspire to one day know how to do all those cool things with the Git command line, etc. But that was way too technical for me. So let's talk about how this works for your citizen developer, because it's really, really quite slick. So citizen developer says, I'm going to do a British version of the form. That's what I've been asked to do. They are going to come into your repos, and if they look at the branches, the same steps, but a lot simpler. They're going to say, hey, you've got your American form feature. I want to make a British form. Let's get rid of the space. Okay. They're going to basically branch that from main. Go ahead and create that. And boom, they've got their feature branch. Now, I don't know how to do this in code, so I want to be able to do this in the environment. Instead of going through all that hassle with the command line, they're going to come over to pipelines and say, all right, I want to go ahead and import this solution because I just copied it from main. So I'm going to run this pipeline right here. Going to click run, and let's go ahead and grab my British changes, my British form version, and the solution is called there. I'm not going to worry about these variables and stuff right now, but you'll note right here this only allows me the one dev environment. This is parameterized, so you can set this up where if you have multiple environments, they can choose their dev environment, of course, but in this demo, I only have the one to pick from, and they are just going to click run. Okay, so all of that stuff that we just did on the command line is basically set up to run in a script where if you watch this run, it's going to do those same steps, fully automated. And again, we're not going to go through setting up the pipelines. It's really not that complicated. If you can type all those same command lines, then you can set up a pipeline. It's really not that hard. But basically what this does is it allows a non-developer, a citizen developer, to come in here, click the run button, and get all of that stuff from source control imported into their environment. So you'll note it installs the tools, it packs it, and it imports it. While that runs, we're going to switch gears and go back to the presentation and talk about some of the pros and cons on where you do this automation. So we just did everything on the command line, okay? There are some advantages to doing that way. There are some disadvantages, and there's some advantages to running this all in DevOps, okay? So right off the top, the scripting, if you do it on the command line, as you saw, it's all PowerShell. If you do it in DevOps, you're going to use YAML with snippets of PowerShell in there. Not a huge difference, but you'll need to know how to do that. And again, there's a WYSIWYG editor, pretty straightforward. They're both kept in source control. They can both be run on demand. Of course, if you're running it on demand from your local machine, then you got to make sure your guys are comfortable with copying and pasting snippets of scripts to run. Scheduled triggers are, however, one big difference. If you're going to set it up on local machines, now you're getting the machines, you got to coordinate all that, which would be a headache. If you're doing it in DevOps, say you want to have an automated build that just backs up your stuff into source control every night, which is one of your first steps that you should implement. Awesome. It's really easy to do. You can set it up to run whenever you want. Also, automated triggers. We'll come back to this in a bit, but once you merge everything into main, there's an automated process that as soon as that pull request is complete, it builds it. Really easy to do in DevOps. Again, if you're on a local machine, that's going to be a bit more work to set something like that up. Speed. The command line is faster. The reason being primarily is, at least by default, if you set up a pipeline in Azure DevOps, the import has to have those tools installed, and it reinstalls them each time. Now, technically, you can set up an agent to keep those stored, etc. We're not going to go into that, but by default, running it from your command line is going to be a little bit faster. Running it in the Azure DevOps runs a little bit slower, etc. But it's not really that much of a difference. It's 1 or 2 minutes. So just be aware of that small difference there. Learning curve. If you are going to have your developers run it on their local machines via PowerShell scripts, again, there's a bit more of a learning curve there. Whereas the big plus for your non-developers, if you put it in Azure DevOps, really easy, moderate, just click the button and it goes. So if we go ahead and come back here, we can see that this finished. And then let's go switch to that environment. Just to be clear, like I said, environments should be throwaway. You should be able to just dump them whenever you want. If I refresh this now, we'll do it twice. We are now back to our main branch, which we had then branched to be our British version of the form in that same environment. Again, you would have 2 different environments, but for the purposes of this demo, we're using one environment. So your citizen developer can now come into here, and they have the exact same experience of being able to do what they are comfortable with, which is to open up the form editor, and they're going to make their series of changes just as well. So in their case, they're going to say this is given name, right? And instead of last name, say they call it surname. And say in birth date, they just happen to pick DOB. Okay? And say on spouse, instead of partner, they called it spouse. And notes, they left as notes, but they capitalized it. Okay? And record name, etc. Okay? So for them, they use the usual tools that they're used to, they love, they're comfortable with, and when it is time for them to commit their stuff back to source control, they're going to come back into the pipelines again, and they're going to basically trigger this by coming to this one right here that says commit solution. They're going to go ahead and say, yes, let's run this pipeline. I want to commit, you'll note it defaults to main. They can't actually commit to main. You'll have branch policies that prevent that. But they're going to say, I'm going to commit from my environment to the British form branch. And here's an example where I said you can't have multiple environments configured. They're working in this dev environment, that solution, and then they're going to say British form changes. Okay. Now I hit tab, it went into the variables. Go ahead and click run. And similarly, this job is going to run without them having to worry about all that stuff that's going on under the hood. So it's going to check out that, set the current date. Again, right here it installs the tools. This is the part where I mentioned it's going to add about a minute to the timeline. But again, they're going to get up and go get a snack while this runs. All right, as you can see, this job just finished up. The developer has had a short break. In this case, it was 2 minutes and 22 seconds, so really not that long, shorter than most little calls or chats at the water cooler. And if we switch back over to the repos section and go look at their branch, that is ready to go for them in here. So they've got their British form changes. In this case, you can see that that one commit is in there, ready to go. So the last thing that they would do is they want this feature deployed. They're going to come in here and say, you know what, I want to create a pull request. I want my feature pushed. It's ready to go. So they're going to select right here, my British form needs to be merged into main. British form changes. They would potentially put whoever needs to review it. Again, this can be configured to just fill in the appropriate individuals based on your project policies. But they create that pull request, and then the appropriate people would review it and merge it to main. So now let's talk about how this all merges into main, and specifically merge conflicts, because we just made 2 changes to the form, neither of which have yet been merged to main. Okay. With branch policies, for demo purposes, I am able to just approve this, but in your environment, you would actually set this up where this cannot be approved by the same individual. It has to be reviewed by 1 or 2 people, and then they go ahead and complete the merge. Now, right now, this is showing no merge conflicts because neither one of those 2 changes have been merged. So let's say the British person went ahead and their changes were approved and they were completed and deployed to main first. As soon as you hit complete merge, that is done. Right here, will be in 1 second. Those changes are now deployed to main. If I go back to the branches, a couple things are happening. Number 1, their changes are now part of main, and you'll see right here there is this blue rotating status icon. In the background, that build pipeline is running, which if we click on this, we can actually see that running. What this is doing is it is going to take from source control, rebuild that solution in a separate clean build environment, and then it's going to export that as a managed solution with a new version number, etc. So we're not going to sit here and wait for this to run, but that is a fully automated process that is going to take those unmanaged changes, create the latest version with everything together in it in one solution. Okay, so instead we're just going to say, you know what, we'll leave that in the background running, and let's talk about the other branch that we need to merge in. So if we go back to our repo and we look at our branches, the original work that we started on the American version of the form, it is 2 commits ahead. Those have not yet been changed in. You'll recall we already started a pull request. If we open up that pull request, it currently shows there's no merge conflicts from 18 minutes ago when we initially created the pull request. So let's go ahead and just say this was approved and complete that pull request. Okay. Uh-oh. Well, although we had checked it 18 minutes ago, at this point in time when we tried to complete it, the system realized actually there is a merge conflict because during that time the other developer had gone in and completed their pull request and now that's part of main, but they both changed the same fields on the form. So how do we resolve that? This is where you are going to need someone with a little more experience knowing how to run Git. So I'm not aware of a way you can do this directly in Azure DevOps. Okay. Instead, if you switch over back to your Visual Studio, check your status, you're on the American form, go ahead and git checkout main git pull. We're going to pull down the latest from main, which you can see we just brought in those changes that were a part of the changes from the British form. Now we're going to go git checkout, go back to our main branch, git merge main, and we're going to put on here no fast forward and no commit. Now strictly this isn't necessary, but I find it to be a best practice because if there aren't any merge conflicts, what this will do is it will stop everything once it's merged in, allow you to see all the changes before making the actual commit. So I go ahead and run that and it tells me, hey, there's a merge conflict. Yes, we know that. In Visual Studio, again, pick your tool of choice. If we look at the changes right here, it's going to say, hey, there's a merge conflict as well. So let's go ahead and let's see what is going on with that. We compare these side by side. Again, not terribly difficult. Since both of us touched the same form, one of us decided to call it first name and one of us decided to call it given name. And I'm going to say, you know what? I love people of all nationalities, but I'm an American and I'm going to stick with just the plain old first name. I'm going to stick, oh, actually, you know what? Notes, for our case, we'll say you're right. Notes is better there. And we're going to stick with last name. And date of birth, birth date, say this is a driver's license application, we'll go ahead and say date of birth. Your version was really the correct version. And we're going to stick with partner. So, record name, oh look, we agreed on that one. There's not actually a conflict, they're both green. Everything looks good. And we're going to say, yeah, we've gone through them all. And we're going to just accept that merge. And we're going to say resolve merge conflict with British chap. And we're going to go ahead and commit that. Okay. And then using the Visual Studio tools here, we can go ahead and push that. Now I'm on my American form branch. So what I did there is I just went through and said, hey, these are the areas where we both changed the same component. They disagreed. And I'm telling you I want this and I want that, and I'm putting that in my branch and committing that back up to the repository. I went ahead and pushed it using the Visual Studio tool instead. So if we come back in here and look at this pull request now and the overview, you'll note that it has recognized, because that pull request came through, that there aren't any merge conflicts anymore. We can go ahead at this point and mark this complete. Once that is complete, my change from the American form gets merged into main, and if you come look at the history, you can see, okay, there is the British form changes, there is the merge of that to main, and right here I went ahead and dealt with that merge conflict and have merged that back into main. So from there, if you wanted to see that final result, you could just as well, it's running the build pipeline. So you can see that's in progress. Within a few minutes, that would be visible in our build environment, so separate environment than the one I've been showing you. But I could also use these tools to push it to any environment I choose. Point being is when you use the pipelines, you don't really, aside from that little bit with the merge conflict when it does occur, you don't really need to have really hefty dev skills. And as you saw what we did there, you don't even really need to have comprehensive, amazing Git skills. You can just use the Visual Studio Code Editor. It's just knowing how to address that. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up with a couple final things. Okay, so a few final things as we discuss this with the automation. Again, we didn't go through configuring the pipeline. That's just done with a YAML editor. Pretty straightforward. If you can copy and paste those commands, there's a little bit more of a learning curve with the pipeline, but again, plenty of content out there on the internet. As noted, you can set up automated triggers. If we flip back over here, for example, and I look in my repos on the branches, apart from the ones we've been using, I've got one called export dev. What this one does is every night, if there have been any changes, you can see like back on March 29th and 26th, I must have changed something, and then on Monday, it just exports those and commits them. So it's a great way to keep a history of everything going on in your environment. So fully automated, that's just doing its thing in the background, and you can set that up in there as well. We already went through that second part of the demo. Gotchas. A couple things to be aware of as you're adopting this. Verifying your workflows and plugin registration steps after import. The pipeline can be run either as a non-interactive user account or using a normal person's credentials. So if you set it up to run as a non-interactive user account and pipelines or flows happen to not get turned on and they're owned by that account because that's the account that was used to import them, then you're going to be juggling to figure out how to get access to them. Now, there are ways to do it, but just be aware of that. If you're just getting started with it for that reason, I'd say you probably just want to use your normal user credentials until you've gone a little further with it. But ultimately, it may be considered better practice to have a dedicated DevOps service account. Also, the Canvas apps. You'll note everything we did there was on a model-driven app. Canvas apps are a work in progress, and we'll dive back into that. They're stored as an MS app file, a blob. Inside of there, you've got these JSON strings that are one single line. So along with those and plugins, they're stored as a holistic unit. So source control will recognize that there has been a change and that there is a conflict when it occurs, but you will need to basically work through those in the more traditional sense. And again, we'll come back to the Canvas apps in just a second. But just be aware that it'll recognize the conflict, but you'll have a little more homework to do to figure out exactly what the conflict is there with both plugins and Canvas apps. Not all the Power Platforms are solution aware. For example, Power BI reports aren't technically part of a solution, so just keep that in mind that there are components that you will need to deploy as before, just as a separate thing apart from your solutions. And versioning of your components. I recommend, for example, in your JavaScript to just put a version number in the JavaScript file itself. The solution as a whole is versioned with a version number, and you can set the version numbers in those pipelines. If you are using the solution packager, now we use the CLI, but you can also use the solution packager. There is a bug in there. I have reported this to Microsoft. You'll note in this directory the app actions was apparently missing an A. That wasn't my typo. That's part of the tool, and it wasn't able to correctly pack or unpack the app actions, which I haven't checked to see if that's been fixed. But if you use the CLI, it works fine. Don't worry about it. Just use the CLI. And then a common mistake I've found in my own workflow is I'll occasionally forget to actually pull down the changes and merge it, and I think I'm up to date. So just again, if you're working from the command line, make sure you actually do pull the latest from main and that you are up to date before you submit your pull request. Taking it further and getting started with this really, As I mentioned, the automated nightly commits and builds, the one I just showed you, that is actually probably where I would start to get your team on board with this, is to create the pipelines and set it up with a common solution if you're using solution segmentation and you're already working on that, and just get it in source control so they can see the history. This is really slick. For example, if we come into here and look at this history, what's really cool is I can actually scope this down and I can say, look, this is showing me the history of everything. Really, I want to look at the entities, and I don't want to look at the one that we just changed. It's too busy. I just want to see what's changed on this one. Oh, almost nothing. Or this one specifically. So you can come in here and you can look at the history for a single component. As we mentioned, look at that one form, which is going to be the busy one from all the changes. And you can see exactly what's happened. And again, you can say, look, let's look at this updated field names demo. This specific commit, you can see right here exactly what was changed. So again, the beauty of source control, even if your team is not actively pushing and pulling, just having this in there, even if you're just a single developer and you want to keep track of what was done when for record keeping, setting up an automated pipeline to commit this on a nightly basis so that you can see at least on a day-to-day basis exactly what files were changed on any given day down to the line of code is invaluable. So taking it further, getting this up and running, that I would say is probably your first step with your team. Just get it in there for them so they can see it, and you'll get, you can get the buy-in from your team. Configuration migration. I mentioned at the start that there is the configuration migration utility, which can be used to migrate data. Probably you've worked with it using the user interface. You can also use that in these pipelines to move the data. So say, for example, you have a list of records that are like, say, preferences for a certain process that vary with environment or business unit, etc. Whatever it is, you can script that to move those over. Deployment pipelines. As you saw, we have the automated build that spits out the artifact, which let's go see if that is done. So if we go back into our pipelines and look at this build solution, and yes, it has finished running, we come in here to the artifacts, and right here you can see you have your demos managed and unmanaged. So right there is your managed solution that you would deploy to production. Now you can take it a little further and you can go ahead and fully automate that to actually deploy that to your target environment. I would say for getting started, don't worry about that just yet. Just get to where you're getting this solution ready to go. And the reason I say that is maybe you want to deploy at a specific time of the day, or there's additional stuff that goes along with it. Just start with getting the actual build done, and then you can work to improve from there. And then the last part are Canvas apps. So let's dive into Canvas apps just a little bit. If you go look into ALM as it pertains to Canvas apps, there's some amazing stuff coming down the pipeline. This video right here with Scott Giroux is probably the best resource to give an overview I've seen of it, and it references the later links, so I just start there. But basically, they now have the ability, still in experimental, where two different developers can work on the Canvas app at the same time in a Maker portal in the Power Apps editor. Really cool, because kind of like when you're working on a Word document in Office, it just continually syncs their changes via source control. It is still in the experimental stage, but along with that, there's also a tool that can, similar to the way we packed and unpacked the entire solution, it can take the individual Canvas apps from those blob MS app files, and it can break them down line by line. So that is coming. It's not there yet in the sense that you will still, again, need to watch for conflicts on your Canvas apps. But again, you want to get going with this now, because this is where Microsoft's going with it, and it empowers your team. So last thing here, just a list of resources. If you have any questions, go ahead and hit me up with those questions. I'm more than happy to help you. This is something that I've personally seen my team struggle with as we looked to get going with source control. And yeah, I'm more than happy to help if you want me to come work through, answer questions. Just give me a holler.